right, again, thanking God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit for this time reminding us of some very basic principles that we probably learned since we were yay high, especially if we grew up understanding or being taught the things of God. But even if we haven't, we have probably heard about a straight road and a broad path. Understanding that those two things exist, as God, or at least Christ, has taught us. Going all the way back to the Sermon on the Mount. And beyond the general way that we know there's a straight and a broad path, or straight and narrow and then a broad path, there is a straight and a narrow road to certain practical principles like peace that Paul is going to low-key talk about in this final chapter of Philippians 4, that I actually want to look at through the lens of the title, Peace, where in the very first verse, he is going to say, therefore, understanding the things he has written in what we have as the first three chapters, or the part of the letter leading up to this point. He's going to say, therefore, stand firm in the Lord, calling them his beloved, as in verses 2 through 3. He is going to talk about peace from the perspective of what seems to be a very real dispute between two of the members that he seems to have a particular affection for, Euodia and Syntyche. He's going to ask the believers there to help them agree in the Lord. As verse 3 is going to say, yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. And so one of the introductions to the concept of peace is not literally him talking about peace, but he's asking the church to help create peace between two people who he seems to value quite a bit. As in verses 4 through 7, he is going to go on to talk about the way that he rejoices, or he's going to call them to rejoice, as he's then going to go and talk about the way that he's rejoiced in verses 10 through 13. He's going to start in verses 4 through 7 by saying, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice, as he is going to say that there are a number of things that are going to seem to create the environment in which God's peace can be a real thing for them. He's going to say, let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The next verse, verse 6, do not be anxious about anything, as he's going to go on to talk about later on in that verse, the way that they should let their request be made known to God. Three things that I want to circle back to, as he will then say in verse 7, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus, pointing our attention not only to our subject or title theme, but that very famous passage that talks about a level of peace that surpasses understanding, to be differentiated by, or sort of differentiated from, the kinds of peace that we can carve out for ourselves that are by definition limited, because as people, we're just limited. Understanding that in verses 8 through 9, or 8 and 9, he's going to go on to talk about peace even more, and talking about things that they should think and practice. Verse 8 saying, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Some translations saying, I think, meditate on these things. So he's going to say then, with regard to practicing, verse 9, it will say, what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace, once again, our subject theme, will be with you. When he's saying practice the things that they have seen in him, it's not a kind of narcissistic Paul cult, for lack of a better term, as I stammer through the Paul cult part. But he is once again going back to that thing that he said to the Corinthians. He is not the standard. He is telling them to implicitly here, or literally, as he said to the church at Corinth, imitate me as I imitate Christ, as he is distinguished over and over again in his longer discussions to other churches, the distinction between his opinions and his counsel and the commands and the direct counsel of God. Paul is not trying to create, once again, his own following. He is simply encouraging them to pick up the healthy side of his example as something that they can use to get a better understanding of God, or Christ himself. Going on, though, in verses 10 through 13, he's going to go ahead and talk about his rejoicing in the fact that they were genuinely concerned for him, and not just genuinely concerned. He's going to go on to talk about the way that they partnered in his suffering in the next set of verses, verses 14 through 20. But in verses 10 through 13, before we get there, he is going to talk about not only rejoicing in, their concern for him, but beyond their concern for him, he has found, whether or not he has people partnering with him or not, my ad lib, to be able to abound in any circumstance, or not abound in any circumstance. Let me just read it. He's going to say he understands how to be content in any circumstance. In verse 11, in whatever situation I am to be content. Actually, he's going to say, let me just read the verse as I said. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. That's the actual quote. As he is going to say famously, verse 12, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need, leading into the possibly more famous part of the verse, part of that section of verses in verse 13, where he says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. As in verses 14 through 20, he is going to go on to talk about how it was kind of them to share in his trouble, understanding you don't have to have lived very long or gone through very much to understand that in times when it gets bad, really bad, you'll get the chance to see the difference between those who are loyal in good times and those who have the strength to stay loyal in times when it's not going so good. So he is commending them because he seems to be isolating the Philippians for a good reason, saying that they were the only ones, so he's going to say in verse 15, to share in his trouble, understanding the way that trouble can drive even good friends away. He is going to go on to say, though, in verse 19, that they can look forward to the fact that their kindness hasn't gone unnoticed, as he's going to say, and my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. As in the last three verses 21 and 22 beginning, he is going to go back to that concept of all that he started out the entire letter with, understanding the way that Paul often seems to bookend his epistles, this time starting out with the fact that he had joy in considering or thinking about all of those who were a part of the church at Philippi. He is going to say, greet every saint in Christ Jesus. And in verse 22, all the saints greet you. Closing out the letter in verse 23, saying, the grace of the Lord Christ be with your spirit. Things that caught my attention most, though, go back to that theme of peace. Some of the things or the components that seem to be prerequisites to peace we saw in verses 4 through 7. Let your reasonableness be known to all. Going back to that whole concept of we're going to reap what we sow. A few chapters earlier, I think it was in chapter 2, talked about that whole concept of, what was it? What was the concept of? That's it. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, understanding that we are not going to sow into conflict and then have God give us a divine peace. We may be left with the peace that we can carve out for ourselves because there's a certain level of peace we can win when we're able to defeat others in our conflicts. But if you've, once again, tried to carve out your own peace before, you probably understand how temporary that is when you get the chance to see in your own life or in the lives of others. I heard a rapper talk about one of the reasons why he left secular rapping, began to give in to who he really was. He was a rapper who believed in Christ. It's because he began to see how those he looked up to, who had all the money, the best deals, and all the things that they seemed to want when they went into the music industry, they still weren't happy. And so I've begun to see that same thing. And that's why his words stuck with me. I've seen and experienced times when everything I thought I wanted to win, I won. And there was still something missing. And so with that, you can carve out a type of peace for yourself, but that typically ends up still leaving you with some area of your life feeling empty. And so with that, he is saying one of the prerequisites is to understand you're going to reap what you sow. Therefore, be reasonable, and don't just be silently reasonable. Carry it as the kind of character trait that allows everyone, like he says in verse 5, let your reasonableness be known to everyone. Then he is going to go into that whole concept of don't be anxious about anything. Good luck with that. But it's something he says we should at least strive to have God help us to accomplish, because if he's calling us to do it, it must be possible. Likewise, he's going to say with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. And those two components seem to remind me of the way that we need to try to unclench our hearts, and the way that he talked to the Corinthians about the way that he was open in his affection toward them, and likewise encourage them to open their hearts to Paul as well, understanding that he was looking out for their best interest, genuinely trying to look out for their best interest, even though he was saying things that they didn't so much want to hear at the time. But likewise, the prerequisite to peace seems to be allowing the peace of God in by unclenching our hearts from around our anxieties. And so one of the byproducts of try not to be anxious about anything is it frees us to let the anxieties go so that God can replace it with his peace, the peace that surpasses all understanding. And then likewise, in verse 6, the latter half of verse 6, as we mentioned, letting our request be made known to God. Maybe the best illustration of that I've seen, or at least the one that comes to mind right now, comes in a Christian meditation that I heard. You may not be much into meditations, because meditations come from, at least the term or the concept can be associated with other belief systems, but the Christian thought process that these folks were encouraging us to embrace was relaxation through a technique that allows us to practically do what the Bible's literally telling us to do in letting go of our anxieties. And they said, look at it as embracing the fact that you have anxieties instead of trying to deny that they exist, because that can be shameful. When the Lord has told us to be free of our anxieties, sometimes we want to pretend that we don't have them. He said, no, own them. Don't be afraid of them, but consider yourself or picture yourself literally taking them out of a bag that you're carrying and then giving them to God, or setting them at his doorstep or at his feet. It might not work for you, but I actually found that helpful, and it helped me to relax. And I probably need to do that a lot more, because ultimately when you're making your request known to God, one of the requests that you can make is if you have trouble through just willpower letting go of your anxieties, something I can relate to, it can help to give yourself a tool, or allow other people who have overcome that same struggle to help you understand how they've done it, and at least try it out, because that actually worked for me. Physically picturing myself taking my anxieties out of my bag that I was carrying that was weighting me down in ways I didn't realize, and physically picturing myself giving those anxieties over to God, requesting that he free me of those anxieties. And so that's the illustration that came to mind for me from others who were able to give what I consider to be good advice. Maybe it works for you, maybe it doesn't. But the bottom line is there are some prerequisites to the peace of God being able to settle into our hearts in place of the anxieties we may be clutching without really realizing it. And so beyond that, it's going to say, okay, once you've gotten to the place where you have allowed God in to replace your anxieties with his peace, understand the process of maintaining that peace or making it more complete. It goes on to what we talked about in verses 8 and 9, to the things that we think about. The things that you meditate on have everything to do with whether or not you are able to maintain or continue meditating on and developing a maturity in the things that God has replaced your anxieties with, or whether or not he's just giving you passing thoughts as you go right back to your anxieties. And so when he says meditate on what is true, what is honorable, what is just, what is pure, what is lovely and commendable, he's saying in excellence and all the things we mentioned before, he's saying you have a responsibility to then value the things that he has replaced your anxieties with, and not going back to, as real life can give us the opportunity. When we turn on the TV, as I say from time to time, we can go right back to the things that offer us the chance to replace the good things that God has given us with the same old things that he has freed us of in the way of anxieties and concerns and frustrations. So we have to be careful of the way that we nurture the things or the peace that he replaces our anxieties with. And likewise, the things that we practice have to be consistent with the things that we then decide we're going to meditate on in place of our anxieties, our frustrations, etc. There's so much more I want to say about Philippians 4, but I'm way over time already, and I'm tired. So with that, sometimes reality just has to take over. I'm probably going to end up doing this one again, but even if I don't, God willing, this has some value in it. But either way, as we often say, God's best to you as you go forward with him, God willing, taking these practical steps toward moving beyond the things that are denying us peace and into some very practical steps along the narrow path that allows God to replace our stresses, our anxieties, and our frustrations with the peace that surpasses understanding.